Hey folks, I'm brownbear. Today I'll be doing a critique of the new Empire campaign recently released for They Are Billions. This video will focus exclusively on the newly released content, which for brevity's sake I'll refer to as just Empire. If you're interested in my overall take on the core gameplay of They Are Billions, I recommend you check out my video from last year on the title's early access release. Let me start by saying that Empire is by no means a bad piece of content. However, when I consider it relative to what already existed a year and a half ago, I reach two conclusions. First, Empire detracts from the existing gameplay that makes They Are Billions fun. And second, it fails to move the needle forward despite a year and a half of additional development time. In today's video, I'm going to try to explain and comprehensively justify these two perspectives. Alrighty, without further ado, let's get into this video. Number 1. Padding. Empire's biggest issue is padding. For the purposes of this discussion, I'll classify padding as follows. What percentage of the content could be removed without eliminating something substantial, something unique, or something creative from the gameplay? If the answer is more than 20 or 30%, the game is probably padded. With They Are Billions, the answer is something like 66%. In other words, every 2 out of 3 hours is redundant. Let me walk through several specific examples to demonstrate how I came up with this number. In particular, I'll talk about the first 11 survival missions, the first 4 tactical missions, and the first 8 swarms. I chose this point because it's around the 20-hour mark, roughly the length of any of the main StarCraft II campaigns or the Reign of Chaos campaign. In other words, it's a more than representative chunk of gameplay for a game of this scope doing a campaign in this genre. Here I've listed out the survival missions on your screen. The Hidden Valley is a tutorial mission, so let's assume that's good content. The Hunter's Meadow, the Frozen Lake, the Lowlands, and the Coast of Bones are essentially identical clear and boom maps. We could eliminate 3 out of the 4 without losing anything. The Lonely Forest can go in the scrap pile as well because it's nearly identical to the Hunter's Meadow. I'll give it half credit for at least being the first scenario to force the player to deal with attack waves from all sides. The Lands of the Giant, the Mines of the Raven, and the Crossroads all feature unique ideas, but none are large enough to justify a single hour-and-a-half mission. These 3 could also be combined into a single scenario without losing anything substantial. Next are the missions that are just too long. The Narrow Pass and Cape Storm are both interesting scenarios with a compelling layout, but there's no reason they should each take an hour and a half. You could execute precisely the same idea in half the time just by reducing the size of the final waves. In sum, we've cut around 60% of the content without losing anything substantial. This leaves us with just 4.5 maps out of the original 11. Next, let's discuss the swarm missions. Of the 8 swarms covered, I leveraged 2 unique strategies, reducing surface area at the outpost in 7 scenarios and placing walls at choke points in 1 scenario. You could eliminate 6 of these swarms and lose nothing, because the gameplay is entirely identical. This leaves just 25% of the content, translating to a 75% padding rate. Finally, let's discuss the tactical missions. Each of these includes unique and interesting mechanics, but the player spends most of their time mindlessly attack moving. You could take all of the creative ideas in these missions, hot lava, grenade, landmines, automated machine guns, discovering units, and spread them across 1 or perhaps 2 missions that are no more than 20 minutes in length each. Given that I spent nearly 2 hours on these, that's roughly 80 minutes of filler for 40 minutes of content. This works out to 66% padding. For me personally, the data speaks for itself. This campaign does not respect the player's time. 2 out of every 3 hours of redundancy is a big problem. There's just too few interesting ideas spread across too many hours of doing the same thing over and over. As a result, the campaign ends up feeling like a grind, with each mission acting as a stepping stone that the player hopes will eventually lead to the actual compelling gameplay. Now to be fair, at first I was open to this approach because I thought at least the fundamental gameplay is interesting. In other words, even if a mission brings limited new ideas to the table, it's still reasonable so long as it still contains the title's fun core gameplay. That brings me to the next issue. Number 2, the technology tree. The problem with the idea that the campaign features fun core gameplay is that it removes practically all of They Are Billions' fun core gameplay. The designers opted to gate all of the game's late game technology behind an interstitial research system. Aside from implementation problems like locking players out of critical tech, practically speaking, it also strips away what makes the game fun to play. Let me first explain my prior experience with They Are Billions, which I discussed at some length in my early access review. When I first played the title, I was blown away by what it brought to the table. The heart of the game, from my perspective, is risk-reward. They Are Billions features a complex technology tree which creates an interdependent decision-making mechanic. Everything you do draws its strategic roots to earlier decisions, even basic stuff like putting down hunters' cottages at the right distance. As a result, the gameplay is well integrated in a way that's very obvious to the player, something that many strategy games fail to fully realize. This complexity is complemented by depth. Later game tech, when applied effectively, is exponentially more powerful than anything that's available at the start. Because the economy features razor-thin margins, and because the relationship between constraint and growth resources creates a snowball effect, players are incentivized to grow as fast as they can. The trouble is they need to temper this with the volatile nature of the zombie threat. One mistake and the entire colony can be lost. The player is constantly weighing risks and making minute decisions that compound with each other and build up over time. The game proceeds in this way until the final wave, always feeling like a race to that critical late game tech. It's extraordinarily engaging. I spent nearly 20 hours with the title before I cleared a single survival mission. Not a single moment of that felt boring. When you get rid of They Are Billions' technology tree, you get rid of a large portion of what makes it interesting. You're no longer thinking about where your markets or banks will go, what technology you want to research next, whether you want to take a risk on a wonder, or where it seems safe to expand to next. Instead, you're just spamming the game's low-tier structures in order to very slowly grow your economy towards the game's heavily padded mission objectives. In my early access review, I critiqued the nature of the mid-game economic boom, finding it boring and frankly exhausting. Even then, I felt that the series would benefit from shorter and more focused missions that highlighted the decision-making mechanic. Yet somehow the designers decided to take this one aspect of the game, arguably its weakest component, and make it the centerpiece of their campaign. It's just not that interesting to build a million different cottages. You're just growing for growth's sake, because a level designer decided 1,500 citizens is a magic number. Let me again use some specific examples to explain what I mean. On the frozen lake, I reached stone tech by day 24. This is as far as I'd gotten in the tech tree at the time I played this mission. I cleared the map by day 27. This scenario runs until day 61. This meant 34 days of spamming nothing but the same units and structures over and over until the final wave. I cleared the Coast of Bones by day 31, but the scenario lasts until day 48. I cleared the Hunter's Meadow by day 20, but needed another 7 days of building nothing but tents to make to the minimum required citizens. The Narrow Pass is yet another good example. Cleared by day 31, last wave at day 45, and minimum citizen count by day 48. The issue here is not that these missions are too long. The issue is that the core gameplay runs out of steam halfway through the mission. There's nothing to tech toward and nowhere to advance for a large proportion of these scenarios. You might be tempted to argue that later game missions are a bit better because the player has unlocked more tech, which I actually agree is a fair counterpoint. The issue is that you need to clear a large majority of the game's content just to get there. Furthermore, many late game missions are just carbon copies of earlier ones. The Oasis is just the lonely forest with a stronger final wave. The Nest of the Harpy is just the frozen lake with a couple thousand harpies randomly spawned in the back corner. I think many players might counter at this point that I'm simply too experienced for the standard difficulty level. Maybe the game would be more interesting if I turned it up to 200 or even 500%. I disagree with this for several reasons. First of all, this is a campaign. This is not the procedurally generated survival mode. The experience ought to be balanced such that the default difficulty level is interesting. That's the whole point of doing a campaign, the ability to actually design and balance a finished product. Second of all, if I were to increase the difficulty, which difficulty should I select? Providing 7 different difficulty modes is confusing. Is the intention here to spend countless hours trying each mode to figure out what's the right fit for you? I don't understand how that's compelling gameplay. But really, my biggest issue with increasing the difficulty is this. What would it actually change? Increasing the difficulty doesn't change the limited nature of the technology tree. At best, it forces you to stay at lower tech for a longer period of time. In the procedurally generated survival mode, the difficulty is an interesting tool. Because the game proceeds all the way to the final wave, the skill ceiling is enormous. Better players can leverage superior decision making, better game understanding, stronger building placements, and a bunch of other skills to traverse the tech tree in its entirety. This is really fun, and I pushed myself to clear brittle missions as part of my early access review just to experience it firsthand. Unfortunately, this experience hinges on the presence of a fully realized technology tree. It's just not that compelling to spam 400 soldiers instead of 200 soldiers. The swarm missions are arguably a better counterexample with respect to difficulty, because adding more zombies arguably forces the player to think more strategically. But the more meta question is whether this slice of gameplay is actually interesting. At a high level, They Are Billions is a surprisingly poor standalone RTS. It's common for my box selects to fail to register, the interaction between the cursor and fog of war is occasionally unreliable, and even simple things like shift-clicking from attack move to patrol are not available. Units also frequently fail to select the correct primary target when attack moving, leading them to take needless damage. I pointed out many of these issues a year and a half ago, but to be honest they didn't matter very much because the RTS aspect of They Are Billions was arguably its least important component. The swarm missions turn this on its head by taking one of the weakest aspects of the gameplay and turning it into a dedicated game mode. It doesn't help that there's again very little creativity here in terms of layout or design. It's just honestly baffling to me. Even if these missions turn out better at higher difficulties, they don't solve the underlying problem that the setup is just not very interesting. This is a good transition into my next point. As I played through Empire, I regularly asked myself this question: what does this game mode uniquely achieve? This cuts to the heart of the second question I raised at the beginning of this video. Given an additional year and a half of development time, how does a campaign move the needle forward? Number 3. Why does this campaign exist? I don't understand why this campaign exists and who it was made for. I'll go through the new features one by one to illustrate. First, there's a fancy new user interface. I like this, it feels very pleasant to use. But slapping a nice UI on top of a flawed research system doesn't somehow fix the flawed research system. There's no indication as to what technology is important and what isn't. New players are unlikely to research what actually makes the game fun and compelling. Meanwhile, veterans who have already experienced what the game has to offer get stuck on Tier 1 tech for hours and hours on end. Next are the new cutscenes. I like these as well. They're kishy, but I think that's what the developers were aiming for. But the cutscenes don't actually do anything in terms of story or lore. They don't connect with the actual game map. If I've cleared half of the known world and established dozens of functioning colonies, how the hell am I still starting scenarios with 4 rangers and a soldier? Like so much else in this campaign, the cutscenes are filler, pretty on the surface, but hollow on the inside. Also new are the tactical missions. I found these tedious. I mentioned earlier that I think they're padded. On top of that issue, I also found myself disliking the main character because he felt so cumbersome. When you look at tactical missions in other games, they highlight an interesting aspect of the gameplay. Narrative progression, fun to use heroes, aesthetically pleasing environments, and so forth. It's not to say that there's a perfect formula for this kind of mission. My point is that a mission should accomplish something meaningful, whatever that may be. From my perspective, Empire fails to do this. Probably the most disappointing new feature was the static maps. One of the benefits of doing a campaign is the ability to design a bespoke map perfectly suited to the gameplay scenario. One good example is one of the later missions in the Orc campaign of Reign of Chaos, where the player needs to take a convoluted route through a warp gate to unlock the ability to clear the main quest. You need to decide how much to leave at home and how much to take with you. Furthermore, the first time you do this mission, you have no idea how far away is the end goal, so there's a risk-reward mechanic in play as well. StarCraft 2 similarly features some pretty intelligent level design. The Dig showcases late-game turtling and choke points. The Mobius Factor highlights the mobility of medevacs. Temple of Unification cleverly showcases the agility and speed of the Phoenix. The key to all of these levels is the way the designers used a fixed map as a tool to express a substantial, unique, or creative idea. My point here isn't to say that StarCraft 2 or Warcraft 3 are the pinnacle of RTS campaign design. Instead, it's to make the more basic point that their level designers set out to actually accomplish something with their mission designs. By contrast, They Are Billions does very little with its static maps. Most are indistinguishable from something you might see in survival. I honestly hesitate to even call them missions because it implies something that's really not there, like narrative progression, objective design, in-game cutscenes, or in-game events. The developers even omitted the simple concept of showcasing a new technology or a new unit through an individual mission. This was something leveraged heavily by both Warcraft and StarCraft, and for good reason. It's a simple and effective way to showcase the game's content. It also teaches the player how to play and forces missions to be designed around a specific interaction that makes them feel unique. It's really surprising that Empire decided against this approach. It's a natural fit for the They Are Billions tech tree. When you put it all together, it's hard to view the campaign as anything more than an inferior version of the survival mode. And that's really the core thrust of this critique. The feeling that I could never really shake as I played through this campaign is a sense of waiting for the game to actually start. It felt like I was stuck in the starting area of an MMO. I can see when the game starts to get fun, it just feels like I need to grind dozens of hours to get there. It really begs the question, why play the campaign at all when you can skip the grind and go straight to survival? Number 4, final thoughts. Let me say again that They Are Billions is an excellent game. I would heartily recommend its survival mode to any hardcore real-time strategy player. In fact, the startling contrast between the innovation of that game mode and the lackluster disappointment of the campaign is largely what motivated me to write this critique in the first place. I'll emphasize that it's perfectly fine if you enjoyed this campaign. What I hope I accomplished with this video is a relatively comprehensive and even-handed analysis. In other words, even if you disagree with my conclusion, I hope the combination of data and anecdotes help convince you that this is a valid and justifiable perspective. I was massively disappointed by what Numanchan delivered here, to the point that I'll almost certainly never finish this campaign. It both fails to move the needle forward and arguably detracts from what was already there. Alrighty, that's everything I had for today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you subscribed to me here and followed me on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.